Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's International Career Series with the International Relations Council. Today's topic is the energy sector. The International Career Series is designed to help you explore different international career paths, whether you're graduating and entering the job market, looking for a change, or just curious. You'll soon hear from an individual who can share their work in an international field, offering insight into their own educational background, career paths, intricacies of the field, and recommendations for your own career search. My name is Natalie Friend. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator VISTA with the IRC. For those unfamiliar, the IRC is a nonpartisan, apolitical organization that provides a platform for greater understanding of international topics and how they intersect with our Kansas City community. We will be recording today's event and broadcasting it live on Facebook. So if you'd like to review this conversation at a later date or share it with someone you think might enjoy it, feel free to visit our YouTube or Facebook page. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Kaitlyn Allen, founder of Global Affairs Associates, GAA, in Houston, Texas. As one of the fastest growing sectors in the economic world, energy, sustainability, and environmental responsibility continues to be at the forefront of our modern society. As the founder of Global Affairs Associates, Kaitlyn has dedicated herself to bridging the gap between business and sustainability. Having worked and volunteered overseas prior, Kaitlyn became aware of how not only the intersection sector works on a global scale, but the rewards and challenges of maintaining a livelihood internationally. Kaitlyn will discuss her current work, her experiences working abroad, and future careers in the energy sector. So it is safe to say that Kaitlyn has fully engaged in the international experience, and we thank you so much for joining us and giving us some of your time today. For this event, feel free to pose your questions through the chat feature at the bottom of your screen throughout the program, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A period at the end. If you would like to connect with us at the IRC, please feel free to log on to our website, irckc.org, which will also be available in the chat box. We encourage you to check it out if you're interested in joining us as a member, receiving our newsletter, or exploring other upcoming events. Thank you so much, and Kaitlyn, I'll pass it off to you to begin.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm in Houston, Texas, and I know that the World Affairs Councils, which is similar to what your organization is doing, they serve such an important purpose in the community. And so I'm just really grateful to be here. I was just going to say, I would love if you're open to turning on your cameras, please do, and we can have more interaction. But if you need to leave it off, I understand. If you're eating your lunch or something, totally fine. But I welcome that. So first, I'll just say a little bit about my company, and then I'd like to give you kind of take it up to the global picture. What is the work we're doing and why in the context of energy, climate change, the transition to a low carbon economy. Hi, William. William just turned on his camera. And kind of give you that big picture of why we're doing the work we're doing and why we have a consulting business in this space. And then, of course, for me personally, just the connection from my say education and early career. And the opportunities I had to study abroad in lots of different contexts, how all of that has really influenced my career. And even though I don't often travel internationally anymore for work, because so much is able to be done virtually, and that's even before the pandemic, right? I think that the global thinking, even if we're all stuck in our own apartments or homes, there's something more to the people who are driven to seek international careers or experiences. There's something more there that's deeper, I think, about the desire to make connections, across cultures. And that's something that we can do even if we're not able to travel, right? So let me hop on the first topic then. So what is my business and why do I do it? My business is called Global Affairs Associates, and we're a boutique consulting firm in Houston, focused specifically on corporate sustainability. And now we call it ESG, the environment, social, and governance. Which sounds strange. Why am I putting those three words together, right? But I will explain that trend if you haven't heard of it. Um, briefly, sustainability more broadly, I think probably most people are familiar with that term. What does that mean? Live on the earth sustainably, right? It means living in a way that doesn't, compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we want to meet our needs, but also not compromise the future generations' ability to do so as well. That's the original definition of sustainable development that came out of the Brundtland Commission, which you can look up in the 1980s. And so that's sort of my North Star in sustainability still, even though the word has morphed and people seem to use it to mean everything these days, and often use it where they should probably be saying environmentally responsible or environmentally friendly and not actually sustainable. There's a difference. That's what sustainability means. And then ESG, so environmental, social, governance factors, are what we call it, Global Affairs Associates, anything that's not on your balance sheet. So if you're a company, you have your financial statements, and those that are required to be, if you're public, reported to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And so that investors can know what they're investing in, and there's transparency there. And then there's also non-required voluntary reporting, which could be about any of those ESG factors, anything related to those three buckets of issues, right? And so more and more, we're seeing a trend where, over the past 10 years, certainly, investors have begun to understand that several ES and G topics. G has actually been quite understood since Enron, that governance is very important to making sure you don't lose all your money in an investment. So how a company is governed and how the board is structured, all of that stuff. But the E and S, the environmental and social, have really morphed into, in some cases, presenting material financial risk to a company. So the biggest, easiest example of that from the energy sector is the Macondo explosion, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which presented nearly killed BP, right? So that was an environmental risk. It was really a black swan event for sure, but it was an environmental risk that had a material financial impact on the company, right? So that's when we talk about ESG, we're talking about all of those non-financial risks that actually might have a financial impact, okay? So Global Affairs Associates does sustainability and ESG consulting focused on reporting and communications. So we help companies in both the public sector and privately held companies articulate, understand what is their ESG profile, how do you measure performance, what do you report, okay? So that's what we do. How does that relate to energy? Well, being in Houston, we have a lot of energy clients. So we, kind of grew up in the oil and gas sector, which has, been one of the sectors that has, had a lot of societal pressure to not only disclose their ESG information and know their carbon footprint, but actually to reduce it. And so actually, when it comes to climate risk reporting, the oil and gas sector is the most sophisticated. I wouldn't say the most, it's all very new for all companies, but the vast majority of climate risk reports out there are published by oil and gas companies. So that's one of the things that we help with. And so being and working in this sector, we've had to get real smart on climate change, on energy transition. What does that mean? What does it mean to transition to a low carbon economy? Why are we doing this? So just for those, I know that Natalie said that there might be some younger students on the call as well. Just to give you a little bit of context on that, right? We have an energy mix, right? So we have coal, we have oil, we have natural gas and natural gas byproducts, LNG, that sort of thing, liquefied natural gas. And then we have renewables, so the wind, solar type things. You have the battery complex. There's all kinds of different pieces of our energy mix. And actually, if you look at the, the energy mix of the world, there's still in many countries wood burning happening, biomass burning, so burning dung or whatever it is that you have access to as part of our energy mix. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which most of you are probably familiar with, that's the UN's Global Agenda for Sustainable Development for 2030, outlines different categories. There's 17 goals for how to achieve a more sustainably developed world, right? Because we still have a lot of people living in energy poverty, right? Meaning they don't have access to any form of energy except, like I mentioned, burning wood or dung, which is also unsustainable and has a lot of emissions, right? So the question becomes, from a policy perspective, if we jump back to the big global stage, is how do we balance the human right, we might call it, to have access to clean and affordable energy? How do we balance that and solving energy poverty as a social issue? How do we balance that with the need to mitigate climate change and avoid the worst effects of global warming, right, through the Paris Agreement, if we're going to use that as a benchmark, so to speak, for how to actually mitigate climate change, right? And so if you're not familiar with the details of the Paris Agreement, won't go into the details, but essentially the idea is that the majority of climate science agrees that global warming is measured at a global average rise in temperature, and that rise in temperature has happened since the Industrial Revolution. So the idea is that we want to limit global average temperature rise to 2 degrees. It used to be 2, now it's 1.5, but originally 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So what does that all mean, right? It's like this so kind of not concrete. How do we actually do that? Well, to do that, what we have is nationally determined contributions for how much each country needs to contribute to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to globally meet that agreement together as a society. So if you're interested in global affairs, international affairs, this is one of the most, if not the most, pressing questions of our time, is how do we achieve that while also recognizing that we have a lot of energy poverty, and natural gas and oil are still, and in developing countries, coal is still the cheapest. If we're talking about affordability, still the most affordable way to get energy to those people. How do we balance that with this very immediate or near immediate in some circles crisis of the planet, right? So these are really nuanced issues, and unfortunately, what you see or what you read, if you're just reading headlines, almost frames it as a culture war of some sort. And I certainly see enough of that, and I speak to that as well in personal conversations and in my work. But what we really have to do as a society to solve that issue is bring everyone to the table and get the same level of understanding of what the problem is, and then we can from there discuss the solutions. But I'll just say, from an energy sector standpoint, based on all of my research, the work I've done, we need everybody on board. That means we need oil and gas at the table. We need wind, renewables at the table. We need to be talking about supply chains. Where are those minerals sourced from that go into solar panels? We need to be talking about end of life issues when it comes to wind turbines. We need to talk about all of it. And to get to those conversations, we have to get past, well, this is my sector and you're stealing my jobs, and back and forth. Look, everybody's going to be losing jobs if we don't solve this. Okay. So that's how I try to frame things up. It's like, let's look at the big picture here and kind of weigh those different costs and benefits. At the end, that's what this is, right? And we also, encourage folks to take we think about a risk-based approach. Risk-based meaning, how do we mitigate the worst risk, right? Or the worst, most likely risk. Well, if we go back to look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, which is a publication they put out every year during the Davos conference, they look at what they consider to be the top global risks to the economy, to the finance system, that could potentially cause economic or social destabilization. Well, what are their top risks? They're all environmentally related. They're related to unmitigated effects of climate change. They're related to natural disasters, of which the total costs, and you can look up the insurance numbers on this, are absolutely been astronomical in the past 5 years. So the folks that run the World Economic Forum, the sort of billionaires club, the folks that are on the Financial Stability Board of the G20 countries, the Federal Reserve Bank, including our own, before the transition to the new administration, even that Federal Reserve Bank has stated that climate change presents a risk to the financial and economic stability over the long term. And so, who really gets this bug in their ear is the investors, right? So the investment community, broadly speaking, has really taken this on as a potentially fundamental risk to their long-term investment portfolios. And these are the folks that are managing your 401ks, managing your pensions. They're thinking 50 years ahead, right? In Japan, it's actually 100 years ahead. The National Japanese Pension Fund, they use a 100-year time horizon. So what's happened broadly is that the investment and financial communities have really internalized that this risk, if it's unmitigated, the risk of climate-related effects on the world and potentially in the financial and economic systems, is so great that we all companies, all portfolio companies, Federal Reserve banks, et cetera, have to get on board to make this transition to a net zero economy if we're going to avoid the worst economic, financial, social, et cetera, effects of this. And the closest thing we have to experiencing that has been this pandemic. And I think that's why we have seen a massive, just massive growth at our company as a response to that, because I think, folks, it's really driven home the fact that, that's what folks at I call them the finance gods. That's a quote from some article I read somewhere, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it, but the finance gods are worried, okay? And they're worried because you look at the pandemic as an example of what can happen to economies, to small businesses, the devastation and job loss across sectors. That's what they're worried about when we talk about unmitigated effects of climate change. So that's the broader environmental context. And so what's the answer to that is what we're calling decarbonization, right? So how do we make the same amount of energy or more, because actually the consumption trends are going up. We need to bring those back down too, if we want. But the consumption is going up, and we do have this energy poverty question. So if we're going to meet that, how do we do that in a way that emits zero net emissions, or even zero absolute emissions? How do we do that, right? So that's the decarbonization challenge, okay? And so right now in the energy sector, and I mean all of the energy sector, including oil and gas, especially oil and gas as a sector, but also the renewable sectors that are now they need to look back in their supply chains too. So it's zero emissions upon creation of electricity, but there's a lot of emissions in the supply chain as well. Whereas when you're burning a fuel, you have the emissions at the point of use, right? So there's different footprints, but we need to understand the whole picture of all of the footprints, and we need everybody on board investing and trying on the new technologies that will allow us to produce energy without producing emissions. And so I'll just pause there, because I know Natalie has some questions about career-wise, but I know, just to bring it back really quickly to the to the global affairs piece, and that is, what we do for people, for clients, is help folks make those connections to the broader context. And I think as a person that's interested in international affairs, that like you on the call, that's where when I mentioned there's almost like this esoteric next level of what what we're interested in as, in diplomacy, international affairs, et cetera. It's that making those connections and then being able to help folks make those connections too. So making the connection between my own energy usage and somebody in, even in the United States in some cases, but somewhere else, I'll just say broadly, someone somewhere else still needing to, gather wood to heat their home, right? Thinking about all of those things and having, empathy and helping everyone understand there's a bigger context here of the fight against global climate change, putting all those things together and being able to hold all of those pieces to thoughtfully make policy, to thoughtfully make investments, to thoughtfully change perhaps an investment policy at a company. And I can put some examples for you in the chat of companies that have done this. All of those things have international impact, even if you're working in say a US company, for example. So anyhow, I'll pause there and let Natalie ask away.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. Really, it's been fascinating to hear about the energy sector, and obviously, like you said, it is definitely one of, if not the most, I think, global sort of sectors that you could think of. So I guess talking specifically kind of about your career and for those who might be interested, and I know you've worked in a number of nonprofit and government sort of positions, and so what sort of education or experiences would you say prepared you for the work you're doing now? And would you say, if, for example, you had a degree or experience, would you say that would be necessary for others to be successful like you?
Well, if I well, let me just answer this one way. I have both of my degrees. So I have a bachelor's in international relations and Latin American studies from Trinity University in San Antonio. And then I have a master's in conflict resolution, which is actually in the government department, so focused more on, statecraft, diplomacy, policy, et cetera, from Georgetown. And I worked for a couple of years in between at refugee resettlement agencies. And so, and doing psychology research, I've always had more than one job. And so when I say I do those things, I've looked back. At the time, I didn't see it. I knew I was interested in national affairs. I loved languages. I took every chance I could to study abroad, including, for those of you who are still in either a graduate program or undergraduate program, the US State Department's scholarship and exchange programs are absolutely top notch, and I highly recommend them. I studied Turkish in Turkey with one of those programs. Anyhow, I didn't necessarily see where it was all leading. Okay, so I was studying things that really interested me. I was doing work that I found fascinating or fulfilling in some way, but I didn't know where it was all going. I really didn't. I just knew that I loved what I was doing in the moment, and that's what kind of each piece led to me starting Global Affairs Associates. And I'll just say, yes, I worked in nonprofits, in research at a medical school, psych department, and then I worked at the State Department while I was doing my my master's in DC, and I loved all of it. But I certainly never took a class on energy. I wasn't interested in it, to be honest. I come from a family of energy people. My dad's a geophysicist, my brother's a geologist. I was just not interested in it. And when I came back, again, I've always been a disciple of, that they call it the still small voice, right? Like, what is pulling me forward? And what had always been my let's say, academic interests, my interest in the work. I loved the State Department. I wanted to spend my career there. I fell in love with it. And then I fell in love with a person. And it was the same pull. And I was like, why I shouldn't be, I shouldn't be moving to Houston for my husband. Like, how not feminist of me, And but I knew that was the right, I just knew it was the right thing. I just knew. And I had no idea what the path was going to be. I had absolutely no clue. Like, if you told me I was going to be a consultant, it's just so funny how our careers, my husband and I, our careers have gotten closer together. They started over here, but now that everyone's focused on decarbonization, we're kind of back here now. But it was the right move. And so, to give you the nutshell, to wrap it up, I loved what I did with international affairs. I loved what I did with languages. I loved talking to people from other cultures and talking about these big policy issues that affect all of us. And that love, just kind of carried me to where I am. What I did was I got back to Houston, which is my hometown, which I didn't want to be at, but I was really in love, and I'm like, this is the right thing. And I couldn't find a job that interested me really at all. And so I said, well, what the heck? I don't have that much experience, but I know things that most people in Houston don't, because I'm coming from this DC world. Maybe I'll throw out a shingle and, do some contract work. That's how it started. That's how Global Affairs Associates started, was me saying, let me just see what I can get in terms of contracts that interest me. That's how it started. And got a contract at Marathon Oil Corporation to be their corporate social responsibility advisor, so CSR at the time, so almost 10 years ago. It was called CSR, and I loved it. I was doing human rights stuff. I was doing economic development. I was integrating, social impact concerns into their operating system. It was amazing. And I thought, this is where it's at for me. So that's how it kind of took off. And Marathon Oil still to this day has, they spearheaded with one of the foundations, I'll say the wrong one, so I won't, but one of the big foundations spearheaded the eradication of malaria on Bioko Island, where their operations are, and, have done incredible work from a social public health perspective there. So I'm like, wow, I'm doing this in an oil company, but I'm still doing this. I'm doing really similar work, right? So that's how it started. And then, of course, it's morphed and morphed and morphed. And now the most pressing question is really, is the decarbonization question. It's the biggest question of our time. And, I always say for folks that if you really want to make a difference, come to Houston, work in oil and gas. That's where they need talent to we have to invent our way out of this. All the solutions aren't quite there. We don't have the ability today. People want to believe that we could just switch it all to wind today. Not possible. It is not technically possible. And so what we have to do is, we need all solutions on the table. All solutions. We need carbon capture, use, and storage. We need wind, we need batteries, we need all of these things on the table. And B, we need the talent, the talent coming out of schools, and the folks that can invent new technologies and data analytics to reduce consumption, all of those things. That's what we need. And we need them across the energy sector. And I mean all forms of energy. So yeah. Go ahead, Natalie.
You kind of reminded me, and I think you make a great point. And you talk about the push towards decarbonization, and it leads into a question, about young talent, and you want people to come to Houston. So what positions and roles are there in the energy sector? And I know, you work in consultancy, but are you looking for, is there room for engineers, data analysts? Like what is it that students or young professionals can do to make a difference in the energy sector?
Well, so this is a tricky question today because of the pandemic. So unfortunately, with the draft, with the pandemic, there's actually a huge tightening of all energy sectors, including, so we have a biofuels company that's our client called Gevo. Um, and, it, you can't make jet fuel if there's no one flying, and so it's a hard time employment wise, for across the board, right? But I will say that there is a huge ecosystem of startup companies, focused on different, varying aspects of these problems. There's, gazillions of them. And this is just the beginning, in terms of the opportunities on the private investment side, I think. So what you're actually seeing if I'm going to like take the 20,000 foot view, is in terms of the energy sector, a lot of the capital, most of the capital, is sitting in the oil and gas sector. And I'm highly overgeneralizing here. But what you're seeing is, and this is over the past several years, this isn't just now, this is 5-10 years in the making. What you're seeing is, and even before that, actually, in some companies, what you're seeing is a joint effort to take a lot of that capital and invest it in R&D to solve the carbon problem. And that's something a lot of people don't know, that the sector is actually, investing, way more actually than the rest of the ecosystem. That might be different today. That's a 2019 stat in my head, but in decarbonization technology. So what does that mean from a practical standpoint is you have a lot of publicly traded companies with a lot of capital that are transferring that into venture type funds. So to basically back a lot of the startups and take the bets on, what are going to be the key technologies to lead us out of this crisis. And so I see more job postings myself on the startup side, and they're actually, being funded, right? So it's like an indirect thing, but it's very interesting. And I can put a few resources in the chat for you if you're just interested. What are those startups? Where are they? What are they doing? Looking at incubators, Houston has the second branch of Greentown Labs now, which is one of the original incubators for green technologies out of Boston. They just opened their second location in Houston. So taking a look at those, the Cannon is another one I can put here. I'll just do it right now. Greentown Labs, and then the Cannon, Houston, the Ion, Houston. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and a lot of money pouring into solutions right now. So if right now is not a time to get a job. There's layoffs happening across sectors just because of the drop in demand. But the private money is looking to the future, So I would say check those out. And then just another one I'll mention that I just find really cool and interesting is geothermal anywhere. If you've heard of geothermal anywhere technologies, geothermal used to be kind of limited to the Icelands of the world, where you're sitting very close to very high temperatures on the ground. But what a lot of the evolution in geothermal has been, okay, are there ways to access heat, right? Which is where it's heat and hot water, basically. Are there ways to access that at places that aren't traditional geothermal hotspots, right? So that's what they're calling geothermal anywhere. And then how do you do it in, can you recycle? This is a very fascinating thing I've been hearing about is, we have a lot of oil and natural gas wells that may be, they're at the end of their life. And instead of plugging and abandoning them, well, what if you could put a closed loop geothermal system in those holes? The holes are already there. That's another way to say, like, take advantage of what's already there, right? And repurpose it. And so, of course, it depends on the bottom hole temperature. And there's, of course, a lot of technical questions that go into evaluating a site for geothermal, but there's a lot of attention on geothermal right now. And I have heard that there's some hiring over there because there's also a lot of private money over there as well.
That's fascinating. I want to ask a question about your work with your consulting company, and also, you can feel free to broaden this out to the field as well. But what makes it, obviously, besides the fact that this sector is quite literally very international, just in general, but what makes your work international? Do you have, does someone in a field like yours or in a position like yours have opportunities to travel, or is it really about the fact that you're working with international partners and commuting with people from across the world every day?
I think for me now it's more the latter, but that's also because I have young children. So I kind of tapped out of the travel stuff a few years ago. Um, But that said, certainly the energy sector itself is incredibly diverse and international, which is why I think one of the reasons Houston is now they call it the most diverse city in the US, is because we have people from all over the world working in the sector and in their home countries, right? So this is a very internationally diverse sector. So when you're working in that, you're interacting with people from all walks of life, all kinds of opportunities. I will say I have for many years now been an instructor for courses for the Nigerian, I'm forgetting NNPC, NPDC, whatever it stands for, their national oil company, basically. And so I've, just through that had an opportunity to have like say a closer, more intimate view into that country and culture that I would have never had. And I'm talking about, a room full of 10 executives from those companies talking through some of these really big challenges. It's fascinating, totally different perspective in terms of the pressures that you face, that people face in different countries and in a national oil company, meaning a state-owned or state-run versus, versus private. So I've had those opportunities as an instructor. Certainly, I think I could be traveling a lot if I wanted to, but I don't want to anymore, at least not right now, at some point. But yes, absolutely. Lots of opportunities to interact with individuals of different backgrounds all day long.
So it sounds like you have just like such a breadth of knowledge about the energy sector. I mean, and really, everything about it. And I wonder, because like you mentioned earlier, it wasn't something that originally interested you, and it's not something you necessarily studied. How did you get to where you are when it comes to your competency in your field, right? Did you learn on the
That's a great
job? What
question.
resources would you recommend, people use to make themselves better candidates?
I think that's a great question, right? Because I did mention that before, and I didn't kind of follow up on what happened in between, right? What happened in between was, first of all, my business was built, and actually was built on referrals. Okay, so and I was having kids. It was kind of like this little tiny practice. I had maybe 1 to 2 clients. I did my course instructing, whatever. It was relatively small. And so a lot of what I learned was in response to the demand. So if a client called me and said, can you work with this particular sustainability reporting framework? I'd be like, let me check it out. And then I'd look at it and be like, yeah, I can do that. And I would learn, take webinars, take trainings, et cetera. All of them, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, has courses now, but SASB was not around when I started this work, didn't exist. So a lot of it was just researching, and and then of course the on the job learning, right? And I'll also give credit to my first my first boss at Marathon, who put me in an oil and gas fundamentals class as a contractor. Even he was such an important mentor to me, and he was like, "You're really good at this, what you do, and I want you to do well. So I want you to understand our company." And so he put me in this oil and gas fundamentals course. So I've had opportunities throughout working in the sector to really learn. But I'll tell you, and I say this somewhat jokingly, but if you want to be an expert in something, just read. Like, I cannot stress this enough, how nobody reads in depth anymore. They read a headline, they kind of follow the news and they think they know what they're talking about, but they actually probably have no idea. I guarantee you, if you are just reading the headlines about oil and gas, or you're just reading the headlines about climate change, you have no clue what's going on. And so that's where I say I saw this whole thing coming on climate reporting because I would read the reports. I was following the stuff coming out of the UN. I was following the stuff coming out of the Financial Stability Board and saying, oh my God, this is going to be huge. Like, really thinking this is going to transform everything. And no one else was talking about it, at least no one I knew. I mean, I'm sure other people were talking about it, but no one in my own network was talking about it. And I was thinking to myself, this is a big deal. We need to get the word out about this. We need to have conversations about this, especially in Houston, right? We're very dependent still on oil and gas. We've diversified a lot since the 80s, but that's really where it started. So if there's a topic you're really interested in, read every report you can, the 100-page reports, not the headlines. You can follow the headlines, but when there's a reference to a report, go read that report, and then go read the 3 reports that are cited. That's how you become an expert in something. And really the key is that people don't read anymore. So go read it, and and then you'll probably know more than the other people in the room about it. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I welcome, great question in the chat, which I can read out to you, Kaitlyn, but also I encourage all audience members today, feel free to shoot a message in the chat if you have a question, or also unmute yourself and ask Kaitlyn directly. But Amber's question is, what are the key skills which make a successful environmental consultant? Coming from somebody who's graduating with their master's in sustainability this year and is currently applying for jobs. So why don't we start with that question?
Yeah. So Amber, my question to you first is, are you an engineer or not? Because that matters to answer this question. You can just unmute if you like.
Yeah, no, I'm not. And I'm also from England as well, but I thought the skills transfer, so.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would just say, an environmental consultant who's an engineer is doing very, very different work than me as a quote environmental consultant. I actually wouldn't even call myself an environmental consultant. I would call myself, say, an ESG or a sustainability consultant. More broadly, there's someone else on my team who's much, much more technically oriented to the environmental piece. So that was why I asked. If you're an engineer, you're probably going to be doing a lot more of the modeling. So Excel modeling, working with SAP to install a GHG emissions monitoring system, the financial and economic piece. So that's huge. If you're a financial analyst, you have those skills. This is so needed, because what's happening right now is companies all over the world are being asked to kind of look at their business models and say, are we really able to be profitable in the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, the 2050 scenario, right? IEA stands for International Energy Agency. So if you look at those scenarios, how does our business model fit in? Does it? That financial analyst, Excel modeling, SAP, I would say if you're more on the engineering side or in the financial analyst side, that's really important for the sustainability consultant. If you're more on the, say, let's call it reporting and communication side, which is what I do, then it's probably knowing, so you want to know CDP, what was used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project is now just CDP, cdp.net. You want to know CDP, you want to know GHG protocol, greenhouse gas protocol, ghgprotocol.org. You want to know the SASB standards, SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. You want to know, it's like an alphabet soup, honestly, it's ridiculous. I'm just put it in the chat for you. And the other one is, of course, I'm sure if you're in the UK, you've heard of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Recommendations for how to evaluate and report on climate-related financial risk. That's, your first job will probably be TCFD, honestly, because it's soon to be a requirement in the UK. I'm sure you're aware of that. But Yeah, so that's sort of the first two. And then obviously, in terms of entry level sort of things to think about. And then, the bigger picture, again, as a global affairs person, as an international affairs person, thinking about making those connections. Okay, in a business, you can't be doing GHG emissions modeling in a silo and not be talking to the CFO and the financial organization to understand how a carbon tax, for example, might impact the business. Making those connections across the organization is just as important as making them from a multidisciplinary, academic standpoint. So kind of carrying that, your master's interdisciplinary skills, carrying that into what you do in a company, whether as a consultant or in-house. But I would say that in my experience, the key differentiator for being a consultant versus being an analyst or technician is that you're making connections for people. You're helping them see how the things all fit together and why. And even though I'm not a technical expert in finance, forget it, and I'm not I can't do a GHG model. Someone on my team can, but I can help them understand that they need to all be in the same room talking about this and help them get aligned. So yep, that's true of any consulting, even if you're not doing sustainability, helping folks make those connections and you being the one to kind of see them and bring them up. Okay.
I think that was a great response. And I think that that's really helpful advice for everyone kind of interested in a global field is communication and the value of making those bridges. Definitely. So Amber's other question was, do you see a global ESG standard being developed in the near future? And what are the challenges to developing this? And what would be the benefits if it was developed?
Okay, so yes, and the challenges are massive and we're not even close. I would say, okay, near future, right? It's going to be a while. And the reason I say that is because if you want to think of the voluntary standard space as a marketplace, it's a free market, and there's a lot of people and organizations that profit from, promoting one framework. And I'm certainly not saying that of SASB or any of these. I'm just saying in general, how a market works is you have competition and you have, particularly on the part of the raters and rankers, which are the ones that say, give a company a sustainability score. So if you go to the Yahoo Finance tab, who's supplying that data is Sustainalytics. Sustainalytics is a company that does these scores. And so, you have to take all of that with a grain of salt because why? Well, Sustainalytics' methodology is secret, right? MSCI's methodology is it's all proprietary. Okay, so this is the problem. Everyone rails about not having a standard, but it's because it's a free market. So unless you actually regulate it and say, we want everyone to use this standard and here it is and everybody follow it, unless you have that happen, and then the question is, well, which one do we base it on, right? Unless you have that, you're going to have this free market, and it's okay to have, I think, varying methodologies, because in fact, there's a study about this called the Aggregate Confusion Project out of MIT that says a company can be in the top 5% rankings in one index and the bottom 20% in another. So obviously, there's massive differences in how these entities are scoring a company or ranking a company, and those matter, right? So, but today, no reasonable investor would only rely on one, right? They're looking at maybe across the board at several, and then they're doing their own research. There's just, I think we're a long way from it. The other reason for that is that all the frameworks kind of say they want to work together. And then, a new one will come out. So last year in 2019, 2020, I guess, the World Economic Forum, along with the big four accounting firms, came out and said they have another new framework, which is drawing upon existing frameworks. I mean, it's like, I think we're a ways off. And I do think that we on the good side, on the positive side is, well, and I'm sorry, I should back up. I'm talking about the US. In the EU, you have the green taxonomy, and so you do have more of a standard, not for reporting metrics, but a standard as to what's considered sustainable and not. And it's very interesting. So you can look at the EU taxonomy for that. I believe there's some other standards in different jurisdictions around the world, already being developed as well. So yeah, I don't know. But I will say that I would follow the IFRS, which I can't remember, international IFRS, I can't remember what it is. You have to look it up. Financial standard setting organizations where the accountants all gather. That's one to follow for that.
I definitely think it's like any other international career, Kaitlyn. There is a bit of a bureaucracy to the work that we all have to find a way to navigate through. So as we get closer to our time today, I encourage everyone to ask any other questions you might have of Kaitlyn about the field or advice she might be willing to give you. But I can go ahead and give it. Oh yeah, William,
Sure.
go ahead.
Yeah.
If I can just make a quick comment, I'm obviously not looking for a job, but this was a really fascinating presentation, Kaitlyn. I really appreciate it. I'm on Peaks Island in Maine. I'm a member of the International Relations Council for Kansas City. And I just love these kinds of programs. So I really want to compliment you for doing this and your comments as well. But we also just finished an hour-long presentation on offshore energy production, which was fascinating and fits right into what you've been saying, because what we heard about was offshore wind energy production and all the conflicting interests, the multilateral players involved, tons of actors involved in this thing. There are all kinds of international aspects to it. And this is offshore wind in Maine I'm talking about right now. But there's obviously a huge Canadian interest in this. There are tons of opportunities for international cooperation on research and development. And then there are supply chain issues that stretch all the way across the globe, which I think is fascinating. So when you look at the energy sector, it's obviously oil and gas is huge, fossil fuels are huge, but also there's a growing, gigantic sector out there that will require, I think, a real mix of skills. It's not just engineering skills, but it's also people who can tell the story. That's really, really important. You have to have someone who can put things together, can synthesize different approaches and different understandings, and then make it clear to everybody what we're trying to accomplish. So I think this was very, very interesting presentation this morning, and I appreciate the fact that you have so many multiple skills that are very useful in our current international context. I'm president of the World Affairs Council of Maine as well, so I found this very interesting.
I'm so grateful
and
for
I
your
have
comments.
to say one more thing to Kaitlyn in particular. I have to say, Çok teşekkür ederim. Çok ilginç. I had a couple of assignments in Turkey. Well, I was in Turkey twice as an Air Force officer.
Oh my God, that's so cool. My uncle was stationed there too. Many.
It's a wonderful country.
Yeah. Oh, I love Turkey. Oh, that is so cool. I love it. Well, thank you for your comments, William. Yeah,
Sure.
I appreciate it.
The
I think there's a
energy sector is a
question.
wonderful field. Yeah.
It's so fascinating.
I think we've got a question from Robin, and I want to be mindful of our
ahead,
time. So,
Robin.
William, thank you so
Sure.
much for the input.
Yeah, unlike William, I can't speak Turkish. Like him, though, I'm not looking for a job either. I'm a lawyer, and I actually advise a lot of corporations on ESG issues. And I just had a couple of comments.
Yeah.
One, I think you're probably going to see a greater degree of standardization of reporting metrics sooner as opposed to later. I think that's largely being driven by the investment community. If you talked about reading, a great thing to read would be the latest letter to CEOs that was published by the chairman of BlackRock.
Yeah.
Definitely worth the read. It'll give you an indication. And with that much money coming on board, I think you're going to start seeing those standards converge sooner as opposed to later. The second factor too is I think it's going to be largely European driven. because I think the EU has done, I think, a much better job of trying to kind of coalesce some sort of framework around those types of reporting standards. But in terms of the opportunity, I think, you're absolutely spot on. There are just huge opportunities in this field, because I think I see it as largely, sort of three pillars. One is I think the larger sort of issue of electrification, and sort of the movement away from fossil fuels and adoption of renewables to get to 100% clean energy. And that's going to be driven by any number of factors. The second one that you mentioned also was that notion of decarbonization of end users. And that comes from everything from, working with energy efficiency in the construction and building and real estate development, all the way to adoption of electric vehicles. And the third one, which probably hasn't been focused on enough, and I think we'll hopefully see some traction in this new administration, is an expansion of sort of working with ecosystems to enhance their capacity to serve as carbon sinks. So that means a greater emphasis on, conservation efforts across the world. So anyway, those are my, that's my 2 cents worth on all of it. But it's, I enjoyed listening. I hone in on anything that is sort of ESG related, because that's kind of what I focus on. And,
well, we should definitely connect on LinkedIn. And by the way, I make that invitation is open to all of you. Please do connect on LinkedIn. And that's in normal times. I haven't been on very active lately because I've just been so overwhelmed. But in normal times, I do try to interact there. But I'll just say, you point out the letter to CEOs. What's very interesting is that, BlackRock has kind of named SASB and TCFD as the key frameworks in the US, but I don't see as much traction for them abroad, which is why that's why, within the US, I think it's pretty clear. If you're a publicly traded company, guarantee you BlackRock is listed on your 10K. Like, you're going to need to do these two. But I just don't know yet if that's really going to translate abroad. And I think that's where, when we talk about the IFRS, the international standard setting for the accountants, that's one to watch. Because if they end up going for SASB, yes, I think game over. But if they kind of are pressured or whatever reason lean toward the Big Four's proposal, and they are kind of different, it's measuring different things. But anyhow, I just think it's very interesting. And certainly, if anyone on the call, Robin's absolutely right. I just wrote it in the chat for you, the Larry Fink letter to CEOs, if you want to read it. Very powerful, important work. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to be mindful of your time today, Kaitlyn, and
Sure.
and I know it's a Friday afternoon, so I guess would you? And it's been fascinating for me to hear about this, because I know very little about energy, but but thank you for sharing. Do you have any final advice that you might want to give someone either curious about your field or actively trying to become a part of it? And feel free to kind of take that wherever you'd like.
Well, these topics are, you could spend years, literally in a graduate program studying them and still, only be an interdisciplinary person, which is really, I know it sounds like I have this deep expertise, but I still feel like an interdisciplinary strategy person, where I'm kind of putting things together. Whereas there are other people on my team that have the deeper expertise, and they might argue with that, but that's kind of how I feel. So I think that, again, what you're interested in and it's pulling you, it's doing that for a reason. Go read that stuff. Is it the TCFD stuff? Go dive deep into that. Whatever it is that pulls you, because look, I try to tell people that in a competitive job market, and, don't focus on the job, focus on what you're personally interested in, because as you become well-versed in that topic, and, do informational interviews, reach out to people on LinkedIn to ask for 15 minutes just because you're interested in their field. I have a startup on the side, which is a whole other conversation. I'll put it in the chat. Y'all can check it out. But a friend of mine was advising us on fundraising for it. And he goes, look, if you if you ask people for money, they'll give you advice. But if you ask for advice, they'll give you money. And I think it's the same, you can make a similar statement about job searching, right? If you ask people for advice or ask to learn from them 15 minutes or whatever, you might open a door. Whereas if you're just like, hey, I really need a job, you're probably going to shoot away. So again, I would just encourage people, it's not like that there's one, I put some resources in the chat, look up all the alphabet soup of all of this, go to our website. We do classes, we do very affordable classes, like under $400, I think. I mean, by university standards, it's very expensive. And by other corporate, if you look at the Moody's classes, they're astronomically expensive. So we do classes. If you're a student, we have a student discount. Just reach out to me or whatever. And then, sign up for our newsletter. We try to do a roundup, get on the newsletter roundups of things you're interested in. The climate risk review is a good one. Ours, of course. Listen to podcasts. That's the other thing. I find podcasts are fabulous because you're really hearing the in-depth, like what's happening in the background. And I know it's 1 and 2, so I'll hop off. But I just remembered too, we're launching a podcast. So there's going to be very soon, you'll be able to find ESG Decoded in your podcast. I don't think it's been approved for Apple yet, so I can't tell you to go there, but it is on Spotify. So yeah, just educate yourself on what you're passionate about and the opportunities will show up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kaitlyn. This has really been a delight. So thank you for being here and sharing with us. And also thank you to our guests and our audience for being a part of it as well. I'd like to close by putting a plug in for some of the IRC's upcoming programming. And also I encourage you to check out the resources Kaitlyn has shared. But in particular, next week, we have an academic world quest conversation, a news and views conversation on fraying alliances. And 2 weeks from now, we have an upcoming international book club and an international film club. This is along with a number of other programs that we're always doing about topics like this one. So if you're interested in anything like that, we encourage you to check out our website for more information, irckc.org. There, you can also find a link to our YouTube channel where you'll be able to find a full recording of this conversation in case you'd like to revisit it because it's been so fascinating. Thank you again, Kaitlyn, for being here, and thank you to our guests. And I will let everyone go.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.
That's
Bye,
about it.
everybody.